What would you do if God asked you to give up the very thing that holds your life together? What if He called you to surrender the one person, the one dream, the one expectation that gives you identity, worth, and future? That is the question Genesis 22 puts before us, blunt, intimate, and unbearable. What is the call of God? In this text, the call does not merely summon Abraham to a task, it begins to dismantle everything on which he built his hope. The claim I want to hold before us tonight is simple and stark. The call of God destroys earthly foundations so that God alone remains our non-negotiable foundation. This is part of a larger conversation about God's call. We have followed Abraham before, called out of Ur in Genesis 12, shaped by promises, tested by waiting, scarred by mistakes. Here, on a mountain, the testing becomes a crucible. The story compresses a lifetime of training into a single ascent. And if you are following this series on the call of God, subscribe and keep walking with us through these difficult passages. We will need each other as we think through what it means to live when the ground beneath us is shifting. The story begins with a divine summons, and it is as precise as it is personal. God tested Abraham. The prose is economical. Each verb is significant. God speaks, Abraham answers, and both of them set out. Read through the chapter, and you find an ordered sequence. The call, the response, the journey, the methodical details, the wood for the sacrifice, the two young men, the fire and knife in Abraham's hand, the dialogue between father and son, the binding, the raised hand, and then, at the climax, the voice that arrests the act. The narrative presents a movement from obedience to crisis, and then, in its resolution, to provision and naming. That structure is not accidental. It is the theological architecture of the scene. Let us walk through the text carefully, attending to its beats and to the language the narrator chooses. When the Lord says, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you," we must stop. The phrase, "your son, your only son," is weighty in the mouth of the narrator. Abraham's son is not merely a child. Isaac is the covenantal promise personified. He embodies the inheritance, the hope for descendants, and the very future God promised. To offer Isaac is to place the hope of a people on an altar. Abraham's response is immediate. He rose early, saddled his donkey, took two of his young men and Isaac, split the wood, and set out for the place God had shown him. There is obedience without explanation. No bargaining, no public argument, no recorded display of theological wrestling in words. The text gives us actions, yet those actions are not emotionless machinery. They are poured with grief and faith, with silence and intention. Notice the detail. He split the wood for the burnt offering. He carried the fire and the knife. He goes up the mountain alone with the boy. On the third day he sees the place, and he says to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." Those words, "we will worship and come again," press their way like iron through a furnace of doubt. How could he speak of coming again? The narrator lets that declaration stand. It becomes a theological hinge. There are small touches that enlarge into meaning. Isaac carries the wood for the burnt offering. It is a haunting image, the son carrying the instrument of his own proposed death up the slope. They walk together. Isaac notices the absence of the animal to be sacrificed and asks, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answers, "God will provide for himself the lamb, my son." The phrase in Hebrew, "Yeshua Yireh," is rich. The Lord will see, the Lord will provide. It is a confession of hope. This hope is not abstract optimism. It is a trust placed in a God who acts, a trust that will be weighted and measured on that mountain. Then Abraham builds the altar, arranges the wood, binds his son and lays him on the wood. The narrative shows the father's hand steady with decision. He reaches out and takes the knife to slaughter his son. That gesture is the textual moment, at which the reader encounters the moral abyss of the story. Without commentary, the text presses us into the same ethical vertigo that Kierkegaard would later call fear and trembling, the ground-shaking moment in which faith and duty collide with the universal moral law. Before we go further into the theology, it helps to recognize that Genesis 22 does not arrive out of nowhere. It is the climax of a recurring pattern that begins in Genesis 12. God calls Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household." That initial summons removed Abram from the security of kin, from the religious habits and networks that defined him. He went without knowing the final destination. Genesis 22 intensifies that pattern. Where Genesis 12 asked him to leave, Genesis 22 asks him to hand over the very guarantee of the promise. The call repeats. In repetition, it sanctifies. Each call strips away a layer of dependence. The ground beneath our feet gets exposed until only God remains. Understanding how radical that stripping is requires some cultural and historical context. In the ancient Near East, primogeniture was a real and decisive social principle. The firstborn son carried the mantle of the family's continuity. He inherited status, the estate, the priestly responsibilities in some strata, and the story of the father's name. To lose the firstborn was to see the family's future evaporate. When a father's identity, honor, and legacy are invested in one child, to be asked to offer that child before God is to be asked to surrender social and economic hopes, the projected future, and the scaffolding of public respect. For Abraham, Isaac is not merely a beloved child. He is the physical guarantee that the promise will be fulfilled. To offer Isaac was to lay the family's insurance policy on the altar. The sacrificial idiom is also embedded in the story's world. Burnt offerings, altars, and animals were part of the cultic life of Israel and of its neighbors. The narrator does not invent a capricious test. The language of offering and burnt offering must be read within that sacrificial imagination. Israel's law later specifies ways to present firstborns and to redeem them, a recognition of the firstborn status. Yet this episode is distinct. It moves the sacrificial language into the narrative of promise. The theological problem that rises here is not only, is obedience to God obligatory, but how does God reconcile justice with the requirement to spare life? How can God, who is just and righteous, ask for such a thing and yet be faithful to word and covenant? That question will follow Abraham up the mountain. We must not reduce this scene to a story about blind obedience or divine caprice. Kierkegaard famously read this narrative and coined the idea of the teleological suspension of the ethical, that Abraham's faith puts him in an existential relationship where he follows a divine command that appears to violate universal ethics. Kierkegaard used the paradox to probe faith's passion and singularity. But Kierkegaard's move can be misunderstood if it disconnects Abraham's act from God's character. Kierkegaard's point is to emphasize the difficulty and loneliness of Abraham's obedience, not to license moral anarchy. We must avoid any reading that portrays God as arbitrary or cruel. The biblical narrator never does. The story's own movements toward provision and substitution suggest that the divine purposes transcend the test without endorsing moral violence. This is where the theological tension of justice and justification presses in. On one hand, biblical theology insists that God is holy and just. Sin has consequences, and the penalty for death stands against transgression. On the other hand, Scripture unfolds God as the justifier, the one who provides a way out of condemnation by satisfying justice on behalf of the guilty. Genesis 22 stages that problem. The demand for an offering seems to confront the reality of death, yet the narrative will not leave us with death as final. It will introduce provision. The story anticipates the logic of substitution and imputation that the New Testament later makes explicit. That is why Paul and the author of Hebrews point back to Abraham. Hebrews 11:17-19 tells us clearly that Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and therefore he trusted that God would fulfill the promise even if Isaac were offered. Paul, too, will take Abraham's obedience as an example of faith that looks to God's righteousness. But before we can name the theological resolution, we must sit long in the ascent. Consider the psychological texture of Abraham's walk. He leaves the servants behind. Only he and Isaac climb the mountain together. There is no place for public posturing now. The walk is intimate and devastating. Isaac asks the question every child would ask, "Where is the lamb?" And Abraham's answer is not a quick dismissal. God will provide. It is a confession that holds both hope and sorrow. The Hebrew phrase, wash yireh, has a rhetorical double edge. It focuses on God seeing and providing. God sees the need. God cares. God will act. Those two verbs, to see, to provide, converge into faith. We can make an honest pastoral application here. The call of God often comes as a removal of the scaffolding we use to hold ourselves up. For many in our pews, the scaffold is not a child, but a career, a reputation, security, or a relationship. When God calls, He does not merely add a project to your schedule. He begins to reveal what you trust as your foundation. Listen to a story from the life of David Martin Lloyd-Jones, a pastor who led many through wartime and cultural change. He tells of a moment early in his ministry when he watched a man of influence lose his social standing and with it his assumed security. This man's identity, once anchored in public approval, seemed to crumble overnight. Lloyd-Jones observed how sudden removal of worldly scaffolding exposed the deeper need. Either you find your worth in the shifting ground of acclaim, or you are forced to look to Christ. In that trial, the man discovered a sober, painful freedom. His life no longer rotated around praise, but around prayer. That is what the call does. It either exposes your idols or confirms the place where only God can be your foundation. Some of you may be thinking, is God really in the business of tearing down what I love? That is the fear that makes hearts recoil. The pattern of calling is not masochistic, it is curative. God does not take to ruin for ruin's sake. He seeks to remove false foundations because those foundations will fail us when we need them most. The call is surgery, not sadism. The point is not to leave you bereft, but to reorient you toward the one who will not disappoint. Yet, this recalibration is costly. It asks us to rehearse sacrificial trust long before the crisis comes. Let us return to the text and attend to some of its smallest words, because small words carry big weight here. When Abraham says to his young men, "We will worship and come again to you," he makes a confession of hope. The narrator preserves this as a moment of faith. Hebrews 11 reads this as an expression of faith that reaches beyond the visible. The author of Hebrews understands Abraham to have trusted that God could, if necessary, raise the dead. That is, that God's power and fidelity would not be nullified by the horror of sacrifice. That theological imagination is precisely the hinge between justice and justification. God's justice is honored because God will deal with the problem of death and sin. God's justification is declared because God will provide a means by which the righteous are declared righteous without injustice remaining unaddressed. There is also a typological rhythm here. The ram in the thicket, which appears in the narrative as the provision God supplies, is not merely a convenience. It becomes a sign. The narrator sets it beside the name Isaac and the altar. The Hebrew wordplay is evident. The place is named, "The Lord will provide," and that naming acts as a theological punctuation mark. In the later canonical reading, Christians see in that ram's substitution a pointer toward the ultimate substitution of Christ on the cross. Romans 8:32 will pick up the logic. If God did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, then how will he not also with him graciously give us all things?